at this point, I'm probably going to get started. Thank you so much for attending this talk, interview, and there's Otter B. But thank you so much for being here. It's a really compelling topic. It's a topic that spans decades, even centuries, if you want to go all the way back to the squatters' riots in early Sacramento history. So today, I just want to give you sort of an overview of the program. First of all, we're going to go ahead and have roughly a 10 to 15 minute lecture discussion about the Hooverville experience in Sacramento, Hooverville/Roosevelt Roost experience in Sacramento, greater Sacramento area. So after about 10 to 15 minutes, we're then going to pivot over to really the heart of today's presentation. And that's a Q&A on the book, the wonderful book, Copy Boy, written by Shelley Blanton-Stroud, who's joining us today. There she is waving. And I can tell you that I've read the book. It is outstanding. I happen to feel that any way you can get people interested in local history, anyway, any avenue you can take to do that, bind the public to their history, you do that. And I think historical fiction is just dynamite. I mean, people know about the Battle of Culloden through Outlander. That's just one example. I know that there are many others out there, but you're going to know about the Hooverville experience in Sacramento by reading Copy Boy by Shelley. So when I'm done talking, we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll have an extended Q&A. You guys can unmute, ask Shelley questions, ask me questions. If you've got comments, we'll do that too. So without further ado, let's start, shall we? So I do want to quickly go ahead and introduce the star of today's show, and that, of course, is Shelley Blanton-Stroud. She is the daughter of Dust Bowl immigrants. She is a professor of writing at Sacramento State. She's also on the board. You're on the board of 916 Inc., right, Shelley? Okay. And if you haven't heard about 916 Inc., it's an extremely active writing advocacy group in Sacramento. And I think a lot of their focus goes into young people, getting them to write. So she's very busy. And of course, she's also a novelist. And she's written this outstanding book. And you're working on another one right now, I believe.
Yes, I am.
Shelley?
I felt a little confused, but yes, I am.
Okay, cool. But today we're just going to stick with Hoovervilles, and as I say in the description, the impervious posh of Clay Street, and then also some time in Berkeley. The book covers it all in Northern California, it seems. So, with that said, let's dive into Hoovervilles. And what I'm going to do, bear with me, I'm going to go ahead and share with you all a PowerPoint. All right. And you should at this point be able to see that PowerPoint. I'm going to ask, let's see, if you can, nod your head or give a thumbs up. Okay, awesome. So Capital Hooverville, Sacramento's Depression era settlements. I could just go on and on and on about this topic. Unfortunately, we've got about 10 to 15 minutes to give you the quick, dirty history on the topic. I'm going to talk about further reading you can do in addition to Copy Boy. That's going to give you a better window into the Hooverville experience in Sacramento. I'm going to give you those titles at the end. So Obviously, a lot of this stuff you know already. We know about Black Tuesday. We know about the Dust Bowl. Post-1929, Great Depression, it releases a contagion of despair across the country. Despair by way of environmental disaster, egg disaster with the Dust Bowl, but also despair as a result of the Great Depression. The antidote for many Americans, particularly those in the Middle West, and when I talk about the Middle West, it's not the Midwest. It would basically include states like Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, parts of Colorado, and really kind of the cotton basket of America at this time. So there is this economic despair, environmental despair that is prompting people to migrate toward, I'll say, perceived spots of opportunity. And of course, really the best example of that is going to be where we are right now in California. So that is our talk, the residue of this despair. And that's going to be the Hooverville, the biggest manifestation that you can see all around you from 1930, 31, all the way through the early 1940s. We do know that the last iteration of the Dust Bowl resonates all the way up until 1940, 41. So even though we're on the sort of the cusp of war, there still are elements of the Dust Bowl taking place in the Middle West. So a Hooverville. So just in case you don't know what a Hooverville is, we have a rough definition. It is a Depression-era assemblage of ad hoc community launched in response to economic and environmental stress. Okay, so let me go ahead. This should allow me to move ahead. Okay, so you can see right here, we've got a picture. I believe this is in Kansas. And what are just really briefly the causes of the migration? Number one is going to be land use. We have too many people for too little land. We also know that between 1915 and 1921, there is hyper homesteading taking place in what we refer to as the Middle West. So that is basically it. There's too little arable land for the folks that are interested in farming. Also drought. I'm not going to go too in depth on this. Obviously, there are oodles of environmental history that's been written about this very topic, but there is a weather anomaly that takes place in middle America in the Great Plains during the 1920s and 1930s that basically helps create this perfect storm that is the Dust Bowl. Also, automation is a big thing that's going on at this time. So between 1920 and 1931, we see a 90% increase in the purchase of tractors, right? So the doorstep, if you will, to the 20th century in America is World War I. It's the Great War. And as a result of that, we see an acceleration of science, and we see the hyper-mechanization of America at this time. And of course, part of that is going to be the tractor. Kevin Starr, the venerable Kevin Starr, in my humble opinion, the California historian, he refers to this as folks being tractored out. So if you can imagine, if you're a farmer and you've got several hundred people to tend to your fields, after you buy a tractor, you have one person that you can pay for $2.14 a day who can basically do all that work that you had hundreds of people doing. Okay, so that actually changes the whole configuration of how you're distributing monies and wages throughout communities at that time. And then, of course, we have general economic malaise, right? And I'm not going to go into the causes of the Great Depression. Typically, that comes down to your economic philosophy. If you're a Keynesian, you'll have your own philosophy. If you're a classical economist, you're going to have your own philosophy. But usually it all comes down to early low money supply in the American economy. And then the Hoover administration, it's very laissez-faire, very hands-off. If you're a Keynesian, you think at that time there isn't enough government intervention. So this is basically what we're looking at insofar as early causes of migration. Okay, so let's see, next thing. Okay, so why California in particular? My son loves to bring this up all the time. When we're walking around Sacramento, it's like, Dad, how similar is this to Italy? Well, I would say there are similarities, especially as it comes down to our Mediterranean climate. It's very easy to grow things here. You can go all the way back to the 1850s. You can look at newspaper articles in the Placer Times, the Sacramento Bee, the Sacramento Union, and there are headlines that scream about the amazing bounties that are taking place. Massive melons. There are others, but we knew very early on that Sacramento would become an agricultural Eden. We also know that roughly at around this time, mid to late 1930s, the Sacramento River Delta is producing 95% of the nation's asparagus crop. That's just one thing that we can look to in terms of our agricultural economy or our agricultural prowess at that time. And then today, the Sacramento Valley takes up maybe 1% of the farmland in the country, and yet we also produce 8% of what America consumes when it comes to agricultural goods, mostly in the form of nuts and fruit. So there's opportunity. We know from the State Emergency Recovery Administration reports that were done in the 1930s that just in the Jaboom Street, Hooverville alone, that 75% of those living there had over 5 years of agricultural experience, tending fields, doing any number of things. So obviously, they knew that California had something special to offer them that obviously the middle America was not at this time. And then, I don't want to go too fast. And then we have Land's End. That's a phrase used by Kevin Starr. I would encourage you all to read if you can. I know many of you have the California Dreams series. It is just a terrific, traditional scholarly treatment of California, but Kevin Starr does a really great job talking about sort of the paradox of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl as being this great economic trauma that would in the long term benefit California greatly. I did mention that Shelley is the daughter of Dust Bowl migrants. We would not have Shelley here with all of her talent and her book and her writing and her teaching at Sac State without something like this happening. And of course, you can go across the board with outside influences having huge impacts on California's development and sophistication over time. So Land's End, if you will. Okay, next page. So why Sacramento in particular? Obviously, you can, and I'm trying not to read the PowerPoint. I made sure to just give very small blurbs, but we're a very centralized location. So even in the mid-1930s, we had a highway system, we had a railway system going all the way back to CP, now SP, Western Pacific, and then also even water travel. River lines were operating between Sacramento and San Francisco at this time. So we're a central hub. Perfect size. Think of Sacramento is Goldilocksville in the sense that it was small enough to where if you came out, if you're the Jode family or the Hopper family and you come out from Amarillo, Texas, and you need a place to stay, you can find a place to stay along a levee or in a farmer's field. And yet, you're also in the state capital, and you have the ability to access services either at the municipal level or the state level, and of course, even the federal level as time goes on. And then also you have access to water. So if you're at this magical confluence of two major rivers, well, I would say the major river of Sacramento and then the secondary river of the American River, you have access to relatively clean water. The Sacramento at this time, 1930s, polluted, but you're still going to use that water to some effect. So that's why Sacramento. So let's go ahead and step into what I think is going to be a very popular slide here. And this is a map that was created. It's probably the coolest map, one of the coolest maps that I've ever seen relative to Sacramento proper. So in 1935, 1936, the California State Emergency Relief Administration did a survey of the Hoovervilles in Sacramento proper with a particular focus on the Jaboom Street area, which would occupy basically from the B Street levee all the way up to roughly North Sacramento, which of course is its own city at this time. Being that we're just out of World War I, this area was nicknamed No Man's Land. And so it was owned by folks. In fact, the two big landowners in this area are a San Franciscan named Edwina Funt and the Merchants Bank, the building of which is historic and it's still on Merchants Way and 7th Street downtown. But take a look at the map. You get a good sense of how things are laid out. When I was back at my computer at work, I had a nice laser pointer that would enable me to show you where everything was. I don't so much now. But notable things I would point out are the different names. So if we move left to right in the middle of the screen, you can see Rotten Egg, you can see Rattlesnake, you can see the general Jaboom Street area. You can also see Shooksville, which would be located by the incinerator, which is still there today. You can also see Jaboom Street, and then across the river in the Broderick area, we would have had what was known as Lewis Camp or Lewis's Camp. I don't have a lot of information on that camp, but to be revisited. And then up near the top of the map, you're going to see the Gardenland area, which was the earliest of all the Hoovervilles at this time. I also forgot, if you can look down, if you can see Y Street / Broadway down at the base of the map, if you go far west, you'll see in quotes Y Street. And that was another Hooverville known to be probably the cleanest and most sanitary of all the Hoovervilles at this time, at least according to the Sarah survey. Okay. So let me go through the different Hoovervilles at this time. And let's take a look here. Sorry, notes. So A number 1 is going to be Jaboom Street. And that's going to be the area, basically you can see the I Street Bridge crossing the Sacramento River. So if you just jut up, just a little tick, you're going to see Jaboom Street. It's very faint, but that is really the heart of the Hooverville community at this time in Sacramento. So it happens to be mostly, like I said, mostly agricultural. 75% of those people have previous ag experience. It's made up of whites, blacks, and Latinos. About 80% of the population is white, but the survey concluded, the Sarah survey, and I quote, "They seem to ignore the difference in color and mingle freely on an equal footing." And what's interesting about this is I think you can actually draw a plumb line through Sacramento history and see this to be a somewhat common thing, even all the way back to the gold rush. This isn't to say that there wasn't racism and there wasn't racial arrogance at this time. But when you're down and out, when you're having to rely on other people just to get by day to day, these superficial bits like race, skin color seem to matter a whole lot less. And I brought up before the labor theory of value, where what doesn't matter in the end is what doesn't seem to matter as much is, your law degree or your medical degree. What matters more than all of those things is going to be your ability to work like a dog, okay? To spend time in, as Shelley puts it in her book, that Natomas tomato field, doing what you can to help your family and get by. So the labor theory of value, which is David Johnson, who's a professor up at Portland State University, he sort of broached that idea. And then let's talk about Shooksville. So we're moving from Jaboom Street just to the east. You can see Shooksville, and like I said, by the incinerator. And this is probably the most minority-rich Hooverville of the Jaboom Street area. So we have Blacks, Latinos, other minority groups. And it actually has a mayor. A lot of the Hoovervilles have mayors. There are governmental structures in place. And at the Shooksville, Hooverville, that is Samuel Shooks, who's an African-American, had been a barber, and then when hard times hit, fled to this Hooverville, and then obviously rose to the rank of mayor. Probably the dirtiest of the Hoovervilles at this time, if only because it's down at the base of the incinerator, which is still operating at this time. And then let's hop down to Y Street again. Sorry about that, everybody. So all the way down at the west end of Y Street. And as I mentioned, probably the cleanest, most sanitary. It is known as the Soviet. It's referred to as the Soviet. In addition to the Y Street, there is a population of Finns, Russians, some Latinos in the area. The word Soviet's thrown around. In the 1930s, there is a concern about communism, the Red Scare. The local chapters of the American Legion are agitating to only let whites work in canneries. They don't want any foreign presence in publicly funded work. So foreigners are feared. Non-whites are suspected of some sort of harm to being done to the community. So that area is known as the Soviet. Now, without our laser pointer, we're going to hop over to the Rattlesnake District, and that's going to basically put us at around 20th Street. So 20th Street, you can see Rattlesnake up there. So just below the American River and just below the Southern Pacific tracks. Suffered quite a bit from flooding, inhabited by single men, many with criminal records. We do know that their cottage industry would have been furniture making at this time. And there was an employment, a division of labor in Rattlesnake taking place. Our next stop is going to be up on 23rd, 25th Street. And this is Rotten Egg. So really not many women or children in this area. To live here, you had to have permission from the city of Sacramento. So mostly men, older men, a lot of war veterans. We'll talk about veterans in a moment, and Latinos. The big industry here was the cracking of black walnuts. And typically you would crack the walnuts, you take the meat out, and then you would sell that meat to local confectionaries. So the biggies would have been the Sutter Confectionery, and then also Martha Washington Confectionery on J Street. So just a little bit about those Hoovervilles. Oh, also really quickly on garden land. Sort of the demographic makeup of that area, you're looking at roughly 95% white. We also know that land was opened up by Fred Jones, who was a Natomas farmer, and he was willing to let folks move into that area and utilize it. The other thing about garden land, it was probably one of the best examples of governmental control. It had a mayor. There were codes put in place, so you couldn't cut timber within city limits. So if you're in garden land, you can cut timber, but you can't take anything out of North Sacramento in terms of timber. You had to keep the grounds clean. You had to put garbage in cans and burn daily. And then sort of some of the more communal things, you had to help each other out, share food, share clothing, and then you couldn't bootleg. So here we are on the sort of in the wake of Prohibition at this time. And of course, a sober Hooverville is probably a peaceful Hooverville right now. So that's garden land. So let's take a look at some pictures at this point, most of which come from Calisphere and the Bancroft Library. So maybe you've seen them before. This first one is probably my favorite. So again, I'm without a laser pointer, but if you look right in the middle of the frame, you can see the PG&E power station, right, which is still there today. It's being converted into a museum. And then if you look over just to the right of the frame, you can see the water filtration plant, which had been built in that big rush of building after World War I in the 1920s. So you had the water filtration plant going in, you had Memorial Auditorium, you had schools all throughout Sac City Unified going in. But realize today that there is a massive interstate freeway running right between the two, right? So right between the filtration plant and the PG&E power station. And then here we have the Hoovervilles. Okay, so that is absolutely one of my favorite photos. And again, you can go ahead and take a look at this if you're able to get to Calisphere. It's also in the Sacramento Room's most recent book, World War II, Sacramento and World War II, or World War II Sacramento, where we talk about the Great Depression and the prelude to war. Okay, so here's another shot. I do believe this is basically going to be from the Jaboom Street Hooverville, looking up toward the levee. So within this area of Jaboom Street, we're looking at roughly 539 dwellings. And for all of those dwellings, we have 8 outhouses. So sanitation is obviously a real challenge at this time. Only 3 of these houses have running water. Okay, so obviously you're going to be looking to either the Sacramento or American River for your water. Okay, next image, children. So part of the Sarah survey was to basically assess the condition of children at this time. And to give you a geographic sense of where we are, you can see if you look at just at the top of the roof of this house right here, you can see the 4 spires coming up from the PG&E power plant. This is an abnormal existence. I don't think I'm going out on a limb when I say that when it comes to kids. They're malnourished, they're poorly clothed, there's gross alienation from other children. A lot of these kids don't get a chance to go to school. Our protagonist in Copy Boy, that's Jane, or Juji, she actually has an opportunity to go to school at this time. She's older, but a lot of kids don't, and they miss out on socialization and these basic building blocks to adulthood. And a lot have to work early. We know that Juji spends time in the tomato fields in Natomas. And in some cases, children are pushed into prostitution. So that's the reality for kids at this time. You can also see that a few of these kids are non-Anglo. So there is diversity in the camps. And in this case, Jaboom Street. Okay, So next photo. And here's another shot. Obviously, we're zooming out a little bit. We get a sense of the levee up there. And then here is another shot. And Shelley, every time I look at this photo, I think that's Uno. That's Uno right there. It's got to be. And you guys will know what we're talking about in a moment. Because I would think Abraham looks much more handsome than Uno. So what I want to talk about right here is the prevalence of veterans. So 20% of those living in the Jaboom Street Hoovervilles claim disability, and many of those are veterans. There's a case study done on a veteran, Joseph Rogers, who comes to Sacramento with his family. He's a World War I veteran. His primary trauma is being gassed. Okay, so he was gassed, but we know at this time, 3 out of 5 beds in government-operated hospitals in America are occupied by men who have no visible physical injuries. They are suffering from shell shock, or what today we would call PTSD. And of course, this is nothing more than an accelerant to the trauma going on at this time. The inability to work, the inability to function, because you're having to shake off what happened at the Meuse-Argonne or at Chateau Thierry, et cetera, et cetera. And to give you a sense of the trauma that a lot of these veterans went through, so in World War II, you're finding an average of 40 days a year. During World War I, you're looking at 60 to 120 days. And I know we have a really tight window because America was only in the war for basically over a year, but when you arrived, the action was intense. To give you an even greater sense of what we're going through today, when we look at our Hoovervilles, our Vietnam veterans experienced 240 days of combat a year. So that is a dramatic increase from both World War II and World War I. So just something to think about. Okay. Oh, and by the way, Joseph Rogers, for a family of 4, was drawing $44 a month from the California State Emergency Relief Administration. Okay. All right. And so this, I think, is probably what would remind me most of what we see in Copy Boy when it comes to Ashanti. Shelley can correct me on that, but there's a moment in the book where Jane drives all the way back to Sacramento because she needs to interview someone for a story that she's doing. And she's doing some sleuthing as well. And she's crossing the I Street Bridge. And I actually am going to read a bit, just a very small caption, but gives you a sense of what she sees when she gets to what would essentially be the Jaboom Street Hooverville. So, and I quote, "She crossed the I Street Bridge, exiting onto the frontage road where the American and Sacramento rivers meet, a space filled with familiar tents of canvas, tin, cardboard, plywood, just a little above her family's old campsite, a mile or two above Tumbleweed." And Tumbleweed is the Farm Security Administration camp, which is run by one of the characters in the group. Unfortunately, I can't say whether there was or wasn't an FSA camp in Sacramento. I'm not totally sure. Shelley will know that. I see her shaking her head no. So there you go. But Tumbleweed would have been that had there been one in Sacramento. Okay, so that's our shanty, and then just kind of finishing up here another photo. So we need to think about same wine, different bottles, as the phrase goes. I know my friend Gray Bracken at UC Berkeley, who's a geographer, he's exploring the parallels between the Hoovervilles in California and the challenges we face today with homelessness. And we know just in Sacramento right now, as of 2017, I think that's the last time we took a census, we're looking at roughly 3,600 people, which was a 30% increase from 2015 when it came to homeless folks in Sacramento. So it's a recurring challenge for us as Sacramentans, and hopefully something that ends, that we can stop. But certainly important to have that historic context as we move ahead. So how does all of this end? So basically between 1933 and 1937, we do see an increase in tax receipts in Sacramento, so for city government and county government. So people are finding work one way or another. We also have the National Recovery Act. So the WPA and PWA are pushing in money. We have a initial infusion of $7 million that goes into road building, the Sacramento Air Depot, of course. We have the construction of the overhead water tanks at Alhambra and J, and then over at Sacramento Junior College, on V Street near the county hospital, which is now today UC Davis. And then we have war in the end. So, sorry, I spoke too soon. So we have these wonderful bullet points right here. So we have war. So I mentioned those those overhead water tanks. This is the one at Alhambra, which once war begins, it's camouflaged. And this is one of the coolest photos, I think, from Sacramento's World War II experience. And then, even though folks are getting pushed out of the Jaboom Street area, I didn't mention that in 1935, we do have flooding, and we have a very controversial extraction of folks from that area by DA Otis Babcock, and then County Board of Supervisor Charles Detterding. There is a concern over public health with the flooding that takes place. And so a lot of the shanties are liquidated. We know that the community chest steps in, gives succor to about 100 families, which is a huge deal, obviously. And then I do mention war. We know by 1943, a lot of these folks take jobs within war industry at the time. So by 1943, we have 15,000 people working at the Air Depot. That's a dizzying number at that time. It's a lot of people in a very small area. Okay, so I mentioned readings, right? So take a look at these readings right here. So we have Kevin Starr's Endangered Dreams. We also have the Sacramento Depression Settlement Survey. The original lives at the California State Archives, but I got a copy, and it lives in the Sacramento room in our pamphlet file, so you can take a look at it anytime you want. And then also what Milton Reese and the late great Jim Henley did within Golden Notes. Those are worth looking at as well. But I'll tell you, in addition to what Shelley's done with her amazing work with Copy Boy, I think there are plenty of avenues to create content when it comes to Depression era Sacramento, the WPA, its impacts. So if you ever wanted to write a book on this topic, I'm looking at you. Let's do it, and then give a copy to the Sac Room when you're done. All right. So this is my contact information. If you have any questions at all, you want me to push stuff to you, even though Central Library is closed, I am there Tuesday through Saturday, and I have access to all the content in there, and I can get stuff to you. Okay. And then finally, I want to talk just very briefly about Ruby. So for years, so Ruby is pictured at the very beginning of this presentation, very different picture, but you can see her. This picture was taken by Dorothea Lang on the far left at the American River Camp in November 1936. She is described as the daughter of a Tennessee coal miner. No work, came west. This is all true, but somewhere along the way, the impression was given that Ruby had TB and that she eventually died. And I think this narrative sort of persisted through the decades, until a couple of years ago, it was discovered that Ruby lived. Ruby survived. and stayed in Northern California. She eventually divorced her husband of the time this picture was taken. She remarried a fellow named Sherman Pearsall, who had a business in Northern California. They eventually settled in Sebastopol, and that's a picture of her in the middle in the 1940s. It's an absolutely adorable photo, if only because she's she's holding a kitty cat that you can see right there. And then to the far left, you can see Ruby. This is a picture taken in 1969, a few years before she passed away early. Sadly, she got breast cancer. So this is kind of a wrap up to what I'm going to say, just sort of a human interest bit when it comes to someone. And by the way, when you read Shelley's book, it's impossible not to think about all of the work that was done by the Farm Security Administration to record this experience by photograph. And I seem to think of nearly every girl that Shelley brings up in the book as having some form of Ruby in her. I don't know why. We do know that Jane is tall, and Ruby looks very tall too. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hop off here. I'm going to stop my share, and we're going to come back to life. So we're going to go ahead and talk to Shelley. So Shelley, you're unmuted, right?
I am.
Okay, terrific. So Shelley, everybody, Shelley, and let's go ahead and do some questions. Thanks so much for being here. And I think in the wake of this sort of whirlwind talk about Hoovervilles, I was wondering if you could go ahead and give us a synopsis of your book.
Sure.
Copy Boy, just released. And I'm going to stop talking. Go ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I wish I would have met you 10 years ago. It would have made a lot of things easier, James, with all your information. But so let me give you like the short version of what this is a novel about. Let's see if I have a copy of it here.
Yeah.
Oh, well, can't find it. It's underneath a whole pile of books. There you go. Thank you. So it's set in 1936, or 37, excuse me. It refers back to events in 36. The main character is Jane. She's a 17-year-old Dust Bowl Okie. She picks tomatoes, as James has mentioned. She lives in the tent encampment in the Jibboom area that James described, right along the river. And she lives there in her tent with her parents. And as the novel opens, their family has a massive fight, a violent fight. And Jane escapes that fight by stealing a car and driving to San Francisco. And as she does so, she leaves her father for dead in an irrigation ditch. And it's sort of like a whole new world now into San Francisco. She tries to find work there in the Depression and can't find work until she disguises herself as a boy. She cuts off all her hair, changes her identity, and becomes Benny. And there she gets work as a copy boy at what is meant to be at the San Francisco Prospect, which is kind of a stand-in for the Chronicle. And she's finding that things are really going well for her. She begins to thrive in a way she never had before because Jane's, as you mentioned, a great big, tall, strapping girl. She's strong, she's smart, she's super ambitious, but those things have never added up for anything for her before. She's not like someone who's valued for what she is at that moment in time. But then when she takes on this boy's identity, strangely, she begins to not just survive, but to thrive. It looks like people are even valuing her at the newspaper. So she starts to get ideas about herself and her prospects, so to speak, until her father winds up on the front page of that newspaper with his arm around a girl Jane's own age, similarly an Okie, and they're on the front page of the newspaper because the girl is in a coma, and she has been hit in the head by with a crowbar a block away from where Jane works. And I don't think I mentioned that when Jane left her father in an irrigation ditch for dead, she had hit him in the head with a crowbar. So at that point in time, Jane begins to do research to discover what has happened exactly to this girl, who did this act, and how it might relate to her family and her prospects going forward in the future. So there are so many other details in there too, but I tried to collapse it to the core part of the plot. So there's your synopsis.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that was great, Shelley. And yeah, I mean, it's so circuitous, and yet as a reader, and I'm not a big reader of fiction, usually nonfiction, but you just sit back and let the book take you. I mean, you're on Clay Street, you're in Berkeley, and you're meeting all of these interesting people, these historical luminaries in physics, and I don't want to give anything away, but anyway, so your next question, so your family roots go all the way back to Hoovervilles in the San Joaquin Valley. So wondering if you could talk a bit about that influence on you in writing the book?
Of course. And actually, I do have one picture I think I will share. Let's do this and get right here. Okay. Can you see it all right?
Oh, cool.
Okay, good. All right, so this is a family photograph for my dad's family. So I'll start by saying that my mother was an only child, and her family immigrated from Oklahoma to Bakersfield, and just outside of Bakersfield, a town called Wasco. As an only child, she didn't put excessive burden on her parents in order to get work. And my grandfather, her father, was able to become a foreman on a farm and ultimately to become a farmer himself. Their crises were different. I mean, she got polio. She was hospitalized starting at about 18 months old for 9 months, was not allowed to see her parents. So there was all kinds of trauma, as you can imagine, as a result of that. But this photograph is of my father's family. It's not all of them, and it's not, there's a couple, I believe this little boy doesn't really belong to them, but it has never been very clear who he is. But my father's family immigrated to the Wasco/Bakersfield area from Texas during the Dust Bowl. And they were the children were 8 redheaded boys and 2 redheaded girls. And they lived, you know, when they got to this land of promise, they lived in their car for some time. They lived in tents, very like what Jane lives in the novel. And they also lived in the Sunset Federal Camp, which was the real-life version of the weed patch camp featured in Grapes of Wrath. So that what you saw in that film and read in that book revealed a lot about their living circumstances. So the reason I show you this picture is that growing up, my family's stories, you know, there were so many aunts and uncles, and they were a family of talkers, and still are. Everybody has stories to tell. And one of the things I thought was so fascinating was that when they would start telling their stories at Thanksgiving, everybody thought every story meant something else. You know, if you ask my Uncle Kenny what they were doing right here, if you asked my Grandpa Emmett what they were doing, if you asked my Uncle Keith, if you asked my father what they were doing out here, there would be different points of view. And my favorite thing about this photograph, though, is my Aunt Dolly, because look at all of these boys, these difficult, unruly, always getting in trouble, breaking the rules, breaking the laws, Blantons. And then in the middle of it, Dolly, a second mama to everybody, with that dog and that smile, managing to be happy in that dirt field in Button Willow as they set up a makeshift high jump. to practice their high jump out there. So the reason that I wanted to show you that is that there's just a bucket load of photographs like this that I was always kind of consuming as I grew up, trying to understand what it meant to grow up in a time like this, and how the difficulty, the trauma that might lead some of them to become really strong and tough and to overcome their difficulties and to succeed, featuring themselves as gritty, whereas others of them were sometimes somewhat emotionally ruined by these experiences and prevented from becoming the people that they might have been. So a lot of the family stories work their way into the novel as anecdotes and sometimes major scenes. The very first scene in the novel, the traumatic event that sends Jane on her way to San Francisco, was taken from a family story. So.
Okay, unmute, isn't it? So, so the book is just full of just this wonderful, granular array of historic citations, and obviously, it took a lot of time. The stuff that jumps out at me is the valley fever that Jane picked up along the way, to have that sort of more gravelly, masculine voice. Tokay grapes gleaming on the vines in Galt, and then red-eye gravy, which sounds very interesting. So obviously you spent a lot of time tapping any number of sources for historic accuracy. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, Shelley.
Well, first, obviously, I leaned heavily on family, not only family stories and photographs, but there was a relative, and I am ashamed not to remember that person's name, but she did a family history of the Blantons, and they had it published. And one of my aunts loaned it to me, so I was able to get names out of that book and just kind of tiny little details. You know, red-eye gravy, well, come on, James, my granny made red-eye gravy, duh. But a lot of things were just sort of family ideas. But there were more traditional kinds of research that went on too. One example of that would be, in the very beginning, I conceived of my protagonist as actually being Herb Caen before it became Jane, a cross-dressing girl. Because I'm assuming a lot of people in here are familiar with Herb Caen, but he was an iconic columnist at the San Francisco Chronicle for, 60 years. He had that role. He played a role throughout the decades, sort of capturing San Francisco at different times with different historical influences. But he was born in Sacramento. In a little house that was recently for sale, I think either on T or U, I'm not sure. But when I thought that my book would be about Herb Caen, it began because I went to the San Francisco Public Library, which has the Herb Caen scrapbook collection. And what they've got is this big box of, not one, many boxes full of records and clippings and photographs from his life from 1936 to 1997. Well, what interested me there was that in Sacramento, he went to Sac High and worked on the newspaper there. Then he went to Sacramento Junior College, which is now City College. And I see you, Jan Haig, professor at Sacramento City College. And he wrote sports columns for the Sacramento Union. So he stopped there and went to San Francisco, and there was a 1-year period between leaving Sacramento and sort of coming to life, springing to life as this, fabulously recognized writer for the Chronicle, a very, very young man. 1 year's time when that scrapbook had no details. Nobody had any details about that 1 year. And so even though all the details I found in the Herb Cain scrapbook collection were fascinating and really colored a lot of the things I did with Janie. The truth is, it was the gap in the research that probably was the biggest provocation, because that was magic. It's like a little caesura. It's a little cave in the research that you go inside and there's nothing in there yet. So it gives you space to invent it. So I think a big difference between a historian and a novelist might be the historian wants to find out exactly what belongs in that cave. And I was thrilled not to know, because that 1 year time said, now this is the place where I can make it up. So traditional research, that was one. And let me tell you two other things, which I have right here. This book, Linda Gordon's biography of Dorothea Lange, is a brilliant book. I mean, it's been so necessary to me, because a major character in my novel is inspired by Dorothea Lange. If you read my novel, please do not think that Greta is Dorothea Lange. Please do not think that Dorothea Lange does the things that Greta does. That's why I couldn't use her name. But that was a fantastic book. And I want to show you one more for people who have a historical bent. My husband, Andy Stroud, got me a gift of this book early in my research. It's San Francisco in the 1930s. It's the WPA Guide to the City by the Bay. And the thing I love about it, multiple things, it's written by authors who couldn't get jobs during the Depression. So the WPA hired them to write everything they could figure out about San Francisco. So I love that at its very root, it is so of that time and written so well. I mean, really strong writers are putting it together. So there's that part of it. But there's also the fact that if I need to know how much it costs to go on a jitney from this street to this street, it's in there. If I need to know how the switchboard operated in this part of town, it's in there. If you need to know the top 5 bars if you're broke, it's in there. So this was a great resource. It got really overused. I should donate to the cause of that publisher.
Okay. And just one little deviation. So you mentioned, these writers being put to work at our own central library. On the 3rd floor, we have what was known as the Wpa Index. Basically, from 1900 to 1938, librarians were hired by the WPA to actually index the bee. So I know many of you historians out there, William, for sure, have used this index that's on microfilm. Of course, now we've got the Sacramento Bee digitized. So we can move on, but just another bit right there. So, here's an easy question. I mean, obviously you enjoyed writing this book, but was there one aspect in particular that gave you the most joy?
Okay, I loved it, which may be why I couldn't stop doing it for almost 10 years. I couldn't just put it to bed. Another more efficient writer might have put it to bed early. But frankly, the thing that I really, really enjoyed the most, that maybe got into a space that felt unique to me, because I believe there are many wonderful historical novelists. So what would make the voice more like me? Well, while I was writing this, I tended to mostly listen to music that was alt country and also roots music. So you might want to think of Lucinda Williams and Gillian Welch, a lot of that kind of music, as well as, Ralph Stanley, the actual roots music, that conveyed something about people like that. The thing that I loved about listening to that music, that really I wanted to convey in my novel and to capture something about it, was that it isn't slavishly historical. Gillian Welch, you hear 1930s, you hear hillbilly music in it, but that is not all you hear. It's got an edge of the contemporary. And so that was one of my favorite stylistic choices. I worked really hard on dialect and things like that. And then I worked really hard to shave off a lot of the dialect because I didn't want the reader to look at Jane as like a historical recreator. I wanted them to think, she reminds me of my student, or I was a little like that. So I wanted it to have definitely to be authentically representative of people at that time, but I more than that wanted it to be authentically human all the time. So it was an interesting task for me to peel away some of the details that I thought were just kind of hamstringing me a little bit. So
okay, so one of the recurring sort of images and elements in the book is dust. And there's a quote that comes from Noreen, who lives in Sacramento in a Hooverville. And she states, back in Sayre, and I think that's Sayre, Kansas, the dust got everywhere, inside the house, inside the stove, all over me, all in me. I breathed it in. It's a part of me. The dust gets in you. Can you talk a bit about the role that dust plays with the characters and in particular Jane?
yeah. Well, first, it always begins with what's literal, what's concrete and literal. So these people came here because of the dust, right? And oh my goodness, Ken Burns' 2012 miniseries called The Dust Bowl features all of these voices of people who lived through it, and these are the kinds of things they say. I never got the dust out. You know, they would take towels, get them wet, roll them up, shove them around the edges of the windows, put wet blankets over the glass, roll it around the edges of the room, trying to block out the dust, and still the dust got in. And they complained about always having dust in their hairlines, in their eyebrows, in their nostrils. And so that was literal. It was something I felt it was important to convey. But even beyond that, it became more meaningful to me because I felt like the dust became a metaphor in a few different ways. One of them, you had mentioned valley fever. Well, even when I was growing up in Bakersfield, people still had valley fever. It's a dust-borne fungus that you inhale, and it travels through your bodies, and it releases and multiplies inside of you, making you sick. It makes it hard for you to breathe. It changes your voice. So I often thought about the dust getting in you in that way, making you sick, changing your voice, changing who you are. And that really got me. There was a trail of research about epigenetics, the idea that experiences that your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had, their drought, their poverty, their enslavement, you know, anything that happens historically in your family can change the DNA of family members so that maybe you don't live through the drought, but you inherit it in your cells with a propensity toward maybe breathing problems or heart failure or something like that. So I was fascinated by the epigenetics of it and how this family in my book made me wonder, what would Jane's grandchildren be like? It made me wonder how much of my personality is connected to my people living in the dirt this way. And then the last thing about it was the literal grit. You know, grit has been the object lesson of my whole family life. You know, the Blantons and the Jacksons and McCormicks did not respect people who were not gritty. You mentioned before, a person will be judged by how hard they work at a time like that, not how fancy they were. Well, the topic of grit is fascinating to me because it is true. some people have this difficulty, this stress, these crises, and as a result, it almost trains them into being stronger. They're better and better and better at overcoming things. But other people who inhale that grit and who are asked to take in too much, more than is fair, become weakened by it and can never, ever become who they might have become. They literally can't breathe under those circumstances. This means a lot to me because I think it's connected to our world today. There are plenty of people who have it tough and they climb over. And there are other people whose experiences and opportunities are way too difficult, way too limited, and it will get in the way not only of their experience, but that of their children and their grandchildren and so on, until someone can turn it around.
So another question, Shelley, for you. So when you wrote the book, you obviously you talk about the migrant condition, but I was wondering if you could speak to any subtext that would in effect be you writing about today, in the conditions today, in the treatment of migrant workers today, and our homeless population today.
Yeah, I do not want to misconvey myself as someone who is of a political bent or a public policy bent. I just have not educated myself that way. So I hesitate to go in and have strong arguments about what ought to happen for migrant laborers and for people who are unhomed now. I don't have that expertise. But what I do have is a strong sense of empathy and an understanding of empathy. And I often think and have thought while writing it that I have so many beloved family members with this exact history of being unhomed, of being hated by the people in the communities around them, living on the side of the road where people in the farm towns hated them because they were dirty, they were from outside, they were stealing jobs, all of that kind of stuff. And when I see people whose families are like mine and who have had that kind of trajectory, then at this comfortable state of their life, turning against the people who are currently unhomed, struggling to find work, not getting the food and the basic supplies they need, I find that very disturbing. So I can't talk about it from a public policy point of view because that's just not my thing, and I don't know enough about it. But I can say it meant a lot to me to be writing this story because I wasn't just thinking about people in the 30s. I was thinking about people and what kind of stress they can and cannot take, what is right for them to take and what is not right for them to have to take, and also about how fascinated I am by the WPA, by the idea that the government at this time of national crisis tried at least to do so much to help so many. And, that we have, I can't remember the exact time of the Tower Bridge being built. I should have asked you about that. Yeah. So right in here, we have so many of these, so much of our infrastructure and so many of our beautiful things come from the government investing in people when they most needed to be invested in.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Certainly, there are two high schools in the area. Either, you can go to McClatchy High School or you can go to Grant Union High School. And they're beautiful. They're, and these are made by artisans whose wages were paid by the WPA. And insofar as Grant Union, local historian Bruce Marwick, he does a great walking tour of Grant Union, and he gives that nice WPA context along the way. So with that, I don't have too many more questions. I could ask more, but I wanted to give folks an opportunity out in Zoom land a chance to ask Shelley a question, or even me a question if there's something I didn't cover with the overview. Looks like Pauline.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And make sure, everybody, that you unmute.
Okay. Hi, Shelley. First, I want to say that growing up in Modesto in the Central Valley in the 1950s, I grew up with the same kind of people. Fortunately, my folks had a little healthier background, but it rang true. It rang true. I want to ask you about audio version. Now, for obvious reasons, Shelley worked on an audiobook project. And we've already talked about how her voice, literally the sound of her voice, was different and impacted. You also, in the book, she's conscious of not using the word ain't because it was going to reveal her origins. But we also know that growing up, as we did, there's a twang. There's an oaky kind of twang that goes along. How did you deal with that? I know the audio version's not out yet. You said you were pleased with it, with the narrator. How did you have that dealt with in audio to make it tell that story?
I'm so glad you asked that, Pauline. And Pauline spearheaded this audiobook project we did, Audiobooks in a Box for the a library system. It was wonderful, great experience. Got me hooked on audiobooks. I am in love with my audiobook narrator, April Doty. I got to audition. And I did a document, and I literally did say in the document while casting that I'm looking for someone who can express a Southern accent, but has to be sensitive about the desire to control the accent. And then at times of great emotion, the accent slips out, then the horror and humiliation when it slips out. I think I went on a little bit too long about that in my audition, but I got exactly the right person. April Doty is a Southern actress. She now lives in Spain. And what I loved about her is that she, when I chose her, she then Zoomed with me, and she had read the book a few times before we had this conversation. And she was so careful, like, how much do you want me to reveal? How angry should she be? That kind of stuff. But I love her voice because she finds many different places emotionally, especially for my character Jane. And when she's angry, dang, that accent comes out. But when she's trying to perform well at work, there's a lot more control of it, except when she gets too excited, then it slips out. So yeah, I think it was a hard task for her. She worked very hard at it, Pauline. And I will also say that the audiobook is in the can. It's not available at Amazon yet, but it is available on Overdrive, so you can get it through the library. Yes, it is.
Really?
Yes, yeah. So I'm sending notes to friends. Please request the Overdrive version at your library. It's also available already.
I'm calling it up right now.
Oh, good. Yeah, Rivka says, of course it is. So there are a few other places, but not at Audible yet.
Okay.
Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you, Pauline. Okay, does anyone else have a question for our author or me? Anyone?
I'll ask one.
Yay!
Hey.
Put my little Zoom hand up there. Let me take my hand down. Those weird little hands. Shelley, there's so much I love in this book. I don't want you to, I want you to talk about what you're comfortable talking about for people who may not have read it. But I want to read 3 phrases that I love so much here. Our protagonist is asked, so, are you funny? And the question is often asked, what's wrong with you? And then, you gone weird. I just would love to hear a little something about that. And as you know, because I know Shelley, this is an issue that cuts quite close to home in my family. So whatever you're comfortable talking about that, but it's beautiful the way your characters address that.
Yeah. So, I mentioned so briefly that my protagonist, Jane, survives by remaking herself into Benny. And when she ultimately sees her mother again, her mother reacts, as Amanda mentions, in a really like cut right to her point. Have you gone funny? You gone weird? They're not going to accept that about you. Well, I think there's a couple things about that. First of all, there would be very minor acceptance of cross-dressing, among that population. That just throws everything off. There's not a great deal of familiarity with it. And it's just the wrong order of things to those people. But I did think that her two parents, as limited as they are, also probably wouldn't go over the top about it. They might just say like, knock it off, put on your real clothes. You know what I mean? Because they've got work to do. They do not have time for identity crisis or identity exploration or anything like that. However, one of the things I really delighted in discovering was that in San Francisco in 1934, I think it's called Mona's, the first lesbian bar opened up in San Francisco in, I think it was in Little Italy. And it's called Mona's, and the waitresses cross-dressed as men. And there were a few other places that, had similar kind of situation, but that was maybe the most clear, explicit expression of that. And I do have, it was important to me in this book that I considered Jane to be in process. I feel, the term, people have asked me about gender fluidity in this novel. And I don't know what else is going to happen with Jane. Maybe she loves men and women. I don't know. Maybe she, I do sense that she's freed up by wearing pants, having pockets, carrying keys, because she can stride broadly across the pavement. She can run, she can jump, she can reach. She discovers a freedom while dressed as a man that she didn't experience while wearing a girl's dress. And I just sort of want Jane to be free to go wherever she wants on that, and at least to have two parents, as limited as they are, to have two parents who wouldn't necessarily totally shut her down about it. So that she could have a certain basic security there. I hope that answers your question, Amanda. Okay, great. Thanks.
This is Rivka. I have I'm not showing anybody my face today. I've been cleaning all day. Great presentation, James. Shelley, I love hearing about the book. I can't wait to read it. I'm an avid audiobook listener, and I have to give you and Pauline credit for that, because I think it was about 10 years ago that you were doing the project, and I was kind of new and clueless, and thank goodness for audiobooks. Our usage is up something like 500% since
oh my gosh.
2019. But I can't help, a series that I'm listening to right now is called The Breadwinner. And it's about young women in Afghanistan who, around the year 2000, had to support their families. They were young girls, and they had to support their families, the women in the family. After the Taliban came in and the men disappeared, they dressed as boys.
Yep.
There's a 4-part series. I just finished the 3rd one. And I just see so many similarities. And I look at those pictures of the Hoovervilles, and that's Zatari camp, where I go and volunteer in the libraries occasionally. It looks just like it. Those children that, and I think the world hasn't changed, and we still have the biases that we have. And thank you for bringing that all to the surface right now. It's so important. It's so important that we don't forget this. So what you're doing is a wonderful thing.
Thank you for that. And I'll connect to something in particular you mentioned about in recent history, the fact that girls are having to do that, there is a lot of that around the world right now. And this has happened since the 1800s. Women pretended to be men, dressed as men, in order to go to war, as an example, or to get any other kind of male job, because those jobs always have paid more than jobs that a woman could get. And so it's always been with us like that. Of course, there has always also been cross-dressing for gender reasons, for sexual reasons, for what style reasons. But really, I'm always interested in work. I find work fascinating, and it interests me the degree to which a woman has to deal with her gender. She has to move through like a scrim of her gender in order to do her work well. So that was always something that was interesting to me. Thank you, Rivka.
Thank you. This has been a great break from trying to clean baseboards.
Shelley, could I have a question?
Yes, hi.
Hi. There's so much to your story, and I just, so many things I would love to talk with you about. But one thing that really strikes me today is the fact that these Hoovervilles and people living in shanties and so forth, only recently, like 2 weeks ago, I was in Portland, Oregon, where I was born and lived many years of my life, and was just stunned to see in so many parts of the city, I'm not talking about the current downtown, but rather all around the downtown, where there are pop-up tents and people living right there along the streets, and people emerging in the mornings who are, they look very middle class in some ways, but they're also hollow-eyed and a bit disheveled, and kind of, this is me kind of imposing my feelings on them, but still they're very out of place. They're very out of place. And so I love the fact that in your historical fiction, you're talking about people in these sets of circumstances that are recurring. And they have, of course, we can go way back, and centuries even. But today it's still very important to begin, for me at least, to begin to figure out how is it? How are these people surviving? And so your comments about that, whether some are strengthened by adversity and some are not.
Right.
And all of that just, it really resonates with me. And I just want to thank you for kind of providing some kind of another rich, thoughtful piece, if you will. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Marilyn. And also I want to say that Marilyn has a brilliant memoir of family called Hardpan, dealing with her own family history coming through difficulty. That is like, it really reverberates. It's, so many of us, that is an important point. So many of us have family history of our people coming through incredible hardship that we need to not forget.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. You worded that very well. And thanks for the compliment.
Okay, gang. Any other questions? All right. Really? No other questions?
I think there was one in the chat up here about the field study of Sacramento Valley dialects.
Oh, yeah, that looks really interesting.
Is Ann Sullivan still here? Can't tell. Let's see. Nope, she might be gone by now. Okay. At any rate, there's a message below.
Oh, cool.
Yep.
So, hey, I've got a question. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm nervous that I might give away some of the book. I will tread lightly. The relationship between Juji, because that's what her dad calls her. Mm-hmm. So Jane and her dad is just, I just find that so interesting that, he causes so many problems for her. And yet there is, I think I wrote down the quote, or I wrote down the part of the book, but you know, when you don't have much, you've got family, and that there's a certitude to that whole thing. And we talk about that relationship because I find it very interesting, even though you don't get a whole lot of contact with Abraham throughout the book.
No, you don't. And about that, it's interesting. Not very long ago, was it 1 year ago? I can't remember. My husband Andy and I went to see Ramlin Jack Elliott perform at the B Street Theater. And one of the funny things about that was, like, I didn't realize, I haven't seen him perform in such a long time. He's an aged man. And oh my gosh, I felt like that was Daddy. I felt that was Jane's daddy. And what my core thing about him was that in a world where work is so important for sheer survival, Daddy is not a survivor in the same way that Mama is. Mama will do what has to be done. She will do what has to be done. Daddy is not hard like that. He hasn't got that ability to do the hard thing. And maybe it's more of a sensitivity to doing the right thing. However, I know that my character Jane respects that sharpness in her mother, but about her father, she respects his talent, that he is legitimately a poetic musician. And when he sings, the people around him, even if they're all sitting on the dirt drinking beer after picking, they're transported by his art. And even though Jane is a practical girl and values what her mother says that she ought to do, she also is capable of seeing what her father brings as being special. And in times of hardship, those special artistic people, they don't always survive. They don't always get the opportunity to become who they might have become. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it seems like you've got your major characters and they're all fleshed out. Their character development is just really impressive. But even some of the secondary figures, for example, Noreen, we spend just a little bit of time with her in Sacramento, but you probably spend a little bit more time with Abraham or Daddy, but you provide such a intimacy, even with so little exposure to each one of these people. How do you do that?
That's very nice of you to say. Well, first of all, I do read an awful lot, and I know I'm so glad now that the research is literally saying the act of reading fiction increases your empathy and your ability to see details about people. So that's one thing. But I will say about Noreen, she was very much inspired by Florence Owens Thompson. Dorothea Lange's most iconic photograph was called Migrant Mother Nipomo, and most people recognize it when they see it, even if they're not familiar with the name. And that photograph, when it was published in San Francisco News, brought 20,000 pounds of food to the camp location where Florence Owens Thompson and her children had been. Unfortunately, they had already left, so they didn't get the food when it arrived. But the mother in that photograph, Florence, is absolutely riveting the way that photograph is taken. You see the dignity in her face, the beauty, but also the damage, and it moved people to act. And yet, after, years afterward, it was revealed in a series of newspaper articles that Thompson really resented it. She did not get her name in the paper. She did not get paid any money for being in the paper. And she felt that that photographer only revealed her as a damaged victim. And she's like, I'm not dead yet. I am a person. I dance. I pick. I take care of my kids. She thought that photograph conveyed her as being a victim. And so I thought a lot about Florence Thompson, and I tried to get a little bit of that into Noreen, that she is she's probably a really fun lady. And yeah, she's really down on her luck, but that is not all there is about her, you know.
And she lived a long life. I think
That's right.
80 and passed away in Scotts Valley. And yeah, it's interesting, a story behind every picture, for sure. So, oh boy, I could just keep going asking questions. Shelley, how's your endurance? You doing okay?
Well, why don't we find out if there's anybody else who has a question, and maybe one for you, and then we won't test anybody further beyond that.
Okay, sounds good. Anybody else?
I have one comment.
Okay.
I have one comment. Hi, Shelley.
Hi.
Thanks so much for this. This is wonderful. Yeah, I'm the chair of journalism at Sacramento City College and wrote a history of the college. And so Herb Cain certainly figures in that history among others. And so I love that he came up in the book. But I've told Shelley this, and I have to say this publicly, that I was in awe of the way she so beautifully and accurately described two things. First of all, how a newsroom operated in the 1930s, how the presses ran, and almost nobody touches this, how linotypes operated, which is one of my personal passions.
Right.
About those great hulking typesetting machines that every newspaper had, you know, at least a dozen of, depending on the size of the paper, right? And so I just wanted to say again that, first of all, Shelley, I wish you'd talk to me about this in the process, because I would have loved to chatted with you about this, because I know a lot about this too. But what my point is, not having, however you did your research was just brilliantly done, because this is stuff that is not generally known to, I think, the general public. And there are many examples of women dressing as boys, or at least cross-dressing, even if it was known that they were also girls, to get into newsrooms. Certainly throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s, that's part of my master's thesis. Actually, my master's thesis actually is about writers and photographers as journalistic teams.
Oh my gosh.
Carl and Shelley Mydans of Life magazine fame. And Carl Mydans was one of the original FSA photographers who did work primarily through the South, but also came to California with people like Dorothea Lange. So,
oh my gosh.
So I am just in awe of this. I just read the whole thing. I inhaled it the first time through electronically, because I didn't have the physical book yet. I just want to applaud you for doing such an incredible job. So if people are interested in that kind of printing, newspaper history, as well as all the other great historical pieces, that's, I think, a really valuable contribution to the literature about this period. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And if there's another Jane, there may be some more Jane books, so I will get together to talk about that ongoing press stuff. I will say it goes back to what I just said earlier. I find work fascinating, and I like to know about how people work and the machines involved and the way they behave. I mean, that was the TV show Mad Men. The great attraction for me in that was like to see how advertising worked at that time period, or at least how it was conveyed that it worked. So it's a great joy to me to get to spend some of that time with the machinery. And one of my regrets, given who my family is that I never got to go into the field because I really wanted a scene that involved the details of what it's like to pick. In my family's case, it was mainly cotton and also potatoes. But, tying a bag to your little kid's outfit so it hangs in the dirt behind them and throwing the potatoes in the bag. So it just didn't get into the plot. So, but thank you for that, Jan.
Awesome. Okay. Anyone else with a question?
I actually have a question, if you don't mind.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to talk a little bit about genre specifically.
Yes, yeah.
That obviously we've been talking about it as a historical novel, but there's a lot of overtones of noir or detective fiction in there. I noticed specifically in kind of how it was told. It didn't necessarily guide the story itself, but just kind of how you presented the characters and what was revealed to the reader. How did you decide to maintain that balance? What about noir attracted you to telling a story with overtones of that?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked that, because I was so insecure about that part of it, because I'm insecure right now, even this minute, that what shelf should it go on? Should it go in the mystery noir shelf? Should it go in the historical shelf? Should it go in the women's coming of age shelf? You know what I mean? Like, every time someone asks me, I don't know what to tell them. And the most honest thing I can tell them is that I wanted a mashup. I love noir fiction, or hard-boiled fiction, and I love noir films, but also I don't know, it's a mashup. It even comes up now when, you know, how do people search for my book? When I tell them where to find it, where should it be? I desperately wanted the noir element. I wanted that flavor, because I love the sense of creeping dread that is part of noir. The idea that that something about the world is off. Authorities can't be trusted. Everybody's at risk. There's low-level or high-level anxiety everywhere. And so each person has to tentatively walk through this landscape in order to figure out who is who and what is what. I love that. And that was one of the big attractions of noir to me, that this was a very anxious time. People had reason to doubt others as well as government. And in fact, a part of that that interested me was I have relatives who benefited from government programs but didn't trust the government, or didn't trust that people would come out to the fields, didn't know what they were up to, didn't know if they had their best interests in mind. And I feel like that sort of suspicious worldview is a big part of noir for me. So. And I also like the mashup part of course, I love all the trappings of the physical, visual trappings of noir, the fedora hat, the suits, the sidelong glances, the shadows. And I really love that it was a 17 and 18-year-old girl wearing that fedora, kind of ruining the idea of it at its base.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, gang. I think at this point we're going to have to wrap everything up. But Shelley, I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the book. Congratulations on the book. We can't wait for what comes next. And down the road, the Shelley Blanton-Stroud papers be donated to the Sacramento room so we can all have access.
Awesome.
In the future. So thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for joining us. Remember, the libraries are closed, but it still has a beating heart. And so saclibrary.org. Also, I'm in the SAC room Tuesday through Saturday. You have my email address, and just reach out. So with that said, thank you, Shelley. We'll see you down the road.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Great.
Everybody.
Really nice. Thank you, James, too.
Thank you. Great job. Great afternoon. Thank you.